Why did the most photographed woman of the 20th century build her entire legend on the story that she was an orphan when her mother was alive for nearly her entire incandescent life? The question hangs in the air of history, a wisp of smoke in a darkened room, a detail everyone saw but no one questioned. It was a good story, after all, a tragedy that fit the script. That story was a lie, not a simple falsehood, but a calculated piece of mythology, sculpted by studio hands and perfected by the star herself. Norma Jean Baker was never an orphan. The truth is far colder, far more instructive. She was a ward of the state of California. A piece of human driftwood passed between a dozen homes, a dozen sets of strangers. This is not the story of her trauma, of the lonely little girl lost in the system. That is the fairy tale they sold you. This is the story of her training. This is the chronicle of how a forgotten child, shuffled through the bureaucratic chill of public charity, learned the deadly art of transformation. How she mastered the alchemy of becoming whatever anyone, at any given moment, needed her to be. It was the only skill that guaranteed survival. The world came to know Marilyn Monroe as a creature of pure light and breathy vulnerability, a Cinderella plucked from the cinders of a lonely childhood spent in a bleak Los Angeles orphanage. It was the perfect backstory, a prepackaged narrative of sorrow that made her eventual stardom feel like a cosmic destiny, a reward for enduring so much pain. The press adored it. The public consumed it. It explained her fragility, her desperate need for love, her seemingly bottomless well of sadness that lurked just behind those famously luminous eyes. It made her a beautiful, broken thing everyone wanted to fix. It was the most successful role she ever played. The inconvenient heart of the matter was a woman named Gladys Pearl Baker. Her mother, a woman who did not die in some tragic, faraway accident, but who lived in the shadows of Norma Jean's life, a ghost haunting the edges of the frame. Gladys was a film cutter for the studios, a woman with fragile nerves and a family history of mental illness that stalked her like a predator. In 1934, after a violent and terrifying psychotic break, Gladys was committed to the state hospital in Norwalk. She would spend the majority of the rest of her life in and out of institutions, a spectral presence her daughter could never fully acknowledge and never fully escape. With Gladys institutionalized and her father a complete unknown, little Norma Jean Mortensen, then just 8 years old, ceased to be a daughter. She became a case file, number 8361, a ward of the court. This distinction is critical. An orphan is a romantic tragedy, a clean break from the past. A ward of the state is a piece of administrative property, an ongoing problem to be managed, moved, and monitored. There is no romance in that. There is only the cold calculus of the system. And the system taught her its first brutal lesson. Affection was not a right. It was a currency. Her first stop in this long, unchosen odyssey was the home of Albert and Ida Bolender in the dusty outskirts of Los Angeles. They were foster parents, paid a modest sum by the county to house the state's excess children. They were ferociously devout, adherents to a brand of Pentecostal fundamentalism that saw sin lurking in every shadow, in every childish impulse. To them, Hollywood and the movies, the very industry that had employed her mother, were dens of iniquity, gateways to damnation. In this silent, prayer-filled house, Norma Jean learned to perform. She performed piety. She performed obedience. She learned to stifle her laughter, to mute her bubbling energy, to fold her hands and lower her eyes, and become the quiet, grateful, God-fearing child they expected. This was not a home. It was a stage. Her role was the good girl. She played it for 7 years, the longest period of stability she would ever know as a child. She learned to read the subtle shifts in Ida Bolender's moods, to anticipate the volcanic rage that could be triggered by a spilled glass of milk, or a moment of unholy glee. She learned that a bright smile, deployed at the right moment, could deflect a sermon. A well-timed tear could elicit a sliver of pity. She was learning to modulate her own being, to turn emotions on and off like a spigot, not for artistic expression, but for basic self-preservation. This wasn't childhood. It was an apprenticeship in emotional espionage. Then, the script was violently rewritten. In 1933, her mother, Gladys, in a period of fleeting lucidity, materialized out of the ether. She had secured a release from the hospital, saved up her money, and bought a small house. She arrived at the Bolenders' doorstep to reclaim her daughter. For a few bewildering weeks, Norma Jean was thrust into a new role, the cherished daughter of a fragile, unpredictable mother. There was laughter, there were gifts, there was the dizzying, terrifying sensation of being wanted. It was an illusion. Gladys's mental state was a house of cards in a hurricane. Her paranoia and delusions returned with a vengeance. One day, Gladys suffered a complete and catastrophic breakdown. Screaming and raving, convinced men were trying to break into her little house.
Norma Jean, just a child, was a terrified witness as her mother was dragged away, bound for the sanitarium once more.
This time, there would be no quick return. For Norma Jean, the lesson was seared into her soul. Love was a mirage. Stability was a trap. The moment you began to believe in a home, it was snatched away from you. The whiplash was not just traumatic, it was instructional. It taught her never to fully invest, never to truly believe. Always keep a part of yourself in reserve. Always be ready for the exit. The Bolenders, however, had unknowingly given her a key. In their war against the sin of cinema, they had taken her to see countless films at local churches, deconstructing them as examples of moral decay. But for the little girl sitting in the dark, it was not a lesson in damnation. It was a lesson in possibility.
She saw women on the screen who controlled their own worlds, who commanded the attention of everyone in the room.
They weren't being told to be quiet.
They weren't being shuffled from house to house.
They were powerful. The Bolenders thought they were inoculating her against Hollywood. They were actually showing her the only way out. With Gladys permanently gone, the full weight of the Los Angeles foster care system descended. Norma Jean became a ghost, drifting through a series of temporary lodgings, a dozen homes in just a few short years. The names and faces blur into a monochrome montage of indifference. The Martins, the Atchinsons, the Stewarts. Each house was a new set, with a new cast of characters and a new part for her to play. For the lonely, childless couple, she was the placid, surrogate daughter. For the family with too many children of their own, she was the quiet, unobtrusive helper. She learned to be whatever they needed, to mirror their expectations so perfectly that she became almost invisible. A human chameleon, changing her colors to blend into the background, to avoid being noticed, to avoid being sent away. She learned that to be herself, whoever that was to be abandoned. Her performance, however, was not always flawless. After one placement went sour, the system, running out of options, sent her to the one place that would become the cornerstone of her future myth: the Los Angeles Orphans' Home. The name itself was a brand, a perfect emblem of tragedy, and she would later tell reporters harrowing tales of her time there, of scrubbing floors and endless loneliness. But the records tell a different story. The truth, as always, is more complex and more revealing. She wasn't just another forgotten child warehoused behind those brick walls. The orphanage was not her prison. It was her university. Inside, stripped of the pretense of family, she was thrown into a raw, unfiltered social ecosystem. It was a world of shifting alliances, of bullies and protectors, of whispered secrets and open cruelties. Here, she didn't have to charm one or two adults. She had to navigate 100 other desperate children, all vying for the same scraps of attention and privilege. She learned to be funny to disarm the older girls. She learned to be helpful to the overworked matrons. She discovered, perhaps for the first time, the intoxicating power of her own developing beauty. The way a certain look or a certain smile could make people stop, listen, and give her what she wanted.
It was here that a figure from her mother's past re-emerged.
Her name was Grace McKee, later Grace Goddard. She had been Gladys's closest friend, a fellow film cutter at the studio. She felt a duty to her friend's abandoned child. Grace was a woman obsessed with the movies, a devotee of the screen goddesses of the day, particularly the platinum blonde Jean Harlow. When she looked at the young, developing Norma Jean, she didn't just see a lonely girl. She saw potential. She saw raw material. Grace became her legal guardian, pulling her from the orphanage and offering her something that felt dangerously like hope. Grace was the first person to tell Norma Jean that she could be something more, that she could be a star. She gave her pocket money for lipstick and trips to the cinema. She taught her how to apply makeup, how to stand, how to smile not with her heart but with her teeth. For a brief, sun-drenched period, life was almost normal. Grace had married a man named Erwin Doc Goddard, and for 2 years Norma Jean lived with them in a real house. She had her own room. She went to high school. She was part of something that resembled a family. She allowed herself the dangerous luxury of settling in, of believing this time might be different. She began to shed the shell she had built around herself, letting the real, vibrant, intelligent girl underneath emerge. It was a fatal mistake. She had forgotten the system's primary lesson. In 1942, Doc Goddard's company transferred him to a new job on the East Coast in West Virginia. The decision was swift and final, and when they looked at their finances, at the logistics of the move, they came to a cold, pragmatic conclusion. They couldn't afford to take the 16-year-old Norma Jean with them. She wasn't their daughter. She was a ward of the state, their responsibility only so long as it was convenient, and it was no longer convenient. The ground crumbled beneath her feet once again. Grace Goddard sat her down and laid out the future. It was a choice, but it was the kind of choice a prisoner is given. Door number 1 or door number 2. Both led out of this life. The first option was a return to the orphanage, back to the institutional green walls, the scratchy wool blankets, the anonymity of being one of many, back to being a number, a file, a problem to be managed, until the state emancipated her on her 18th birthday. It was a return to the nothing from which she had just escaped. The second option was a boy who lived down the street, a 21-year-old factory worker named James Doherty. Grace had already spoken to his parents. An arrangement could be made. She wasn't being offered a romance. She was being offered a solution, a way to avoid the orphanage by transferring her legal guardianship from the state to a husband. She was 16 years old, and she was being told to choose between the orphanage and the altar, between being a ward of the state or becoming a wife. What do you do when the only way to save yourself is to kill the person you are? When survival demands the sacrifice of your own identity? For 16-year-old Norma Jean Baker, this wasn't a philosophical question. It was a business proposal. The orphanage or the altar. Two different cages. She looked at the boy, Jim Doherty, a friendly, simple man who saw a pretty girl. She looked at the four walls of the orphanage that she knew would suffocate her. And in that moment, she made the first, truly calculated, ruthless decision of her life. She chose the altar, not for love, not for passion, but for the same reason a castaway chooses a piece of driftwood in a storm. It was a means to an end. On June 19, 1942, just weeks after her 16th birthday, she became Mrs. James Doherty. She dropped out of high school. She moved into a small apartment with her new husband. The system had finally released its grip. She had escaped. But what had she escaped to? She became a housewife, another role. She learned to cook, to clean, to play the part of the happy young bride for a man who believed he had married a sweet, simple girl. She was performing again, but this time, the stage was a kitchen, and the audience was one. She was safe. She was secure, and she was slowly, quietly, dying of boredom. This wasn't a life. It was a holding pattern, a pause. The world, however, was not on pause. World War II was raging, and soon, the war came for her small, constructed life. Doherty, like millions of other young men, joined the Merchant Marines and was shipped out to the Pacific. And suddenly, Norma Jean was alone again. But this time, it was different. She wasn't a ward of the state. She was a married woman, a citizen with a small measure of freedom, and with her husband gone, she needed a job. So she walked into the Radioplane Munitions Factory in Burbank, California. For the first time in her life, she was earning her own money. She wasn't dependent on the charity of foster parents or the legal framework of a husband. She was assembling drone parts, working with her hands, surrounded by other women who were also building new lives for themselves in the crucible of war. It was loud, repetitive, unglamorous work, but it was hers. And it was here, amidst the smell of oil and metal, that fate, or something that looked a lot like it, came looking for her. In late 1944, a young Army photographer named David Conover was sent to the factory on assignment from Captain Ronald Reagan's 1st Motion Picture Unit. His mission: to take morale-boosting pictures of pretty girls doing their part for the war effort. He walked the factory floor, snapping photos of women working on the assembly lines. And then he saw her, a young woman with a halo of curly brown hair, her face smudged with grease, but with a smile that seemed to generate its own light. What did Conover see in that moment? He saw a natural, someone who didn't just tolerate the camera, but loved it. Someone who came alive when the lens was pointed at her. But what he was really seeing wasn't just raw talent. He was seeing years of training. He was seeing the culmination of 1,000 performances. Norma Jean had spent her entire life learning to read people, to give them exactly the expression they wanted, to project an image of compliance, of happiness, of whatever was required to survive. The camera was just another set of eyes to please, another foster parent to charm, another social worker to win over, and she knew exactly what to do. Conover was captivated. He told her she was a photographer's dream. He couldn't stop taking pictures of her. He encouraged her, telling her she had the potential to be a model. That single word, model, was a key unlocking a door she didn't even know existed. It was a lifeline, thrown into the stagnant pool of her domestic life. A model wasn't a wife. A model wasn't a factory worker. A model wasn't an orphan. A model was someone people looked at. Someone who was seen, not ignored. Someone who was chosen. A fire was lit. Conover's praise was the spark, but the fuel had been there all along, accumulating over years of neglect and invisibility. She started to think, if a stranger with a camera could see this in her, What else was there?
This wasn't about being pretty.
It was about power. The power to control how people saw her. The power to create a new self.
She quit the factory. She took Conover's advice and signed up with the Blue Book model agency.
A new performance was about to begin. Emmeline Snively, the head of the agency, saw the same thing Conover did. Raw, unformed potential. But she also saw the flaws.
The girl next door look wasn't going to cut it in the competitive world of print modeling.
Her hair, she said, was a mousy brown, and her hairline was too low.
Her walk was unrefined.
She was pretty, but she wasn't a professional.
Snively's critique wasn't a rejection.
It was a blueprint. And Norma Jean, the perpetual student of survival, listened intently.
She was given a list of instructions,
a set of rules for a new character she was to play.
She enrolled in their 3-month modeling course. She studied the poses, the smiles, the subtle art of selling a product by selling herself.
But the most significant change was yet to come. Snively gave her the crucial piece of advice that would define her entire image.
Your hair, she said.
It's too dark.
It photographs poorly.
You should go blonde. Was this just a simple cosmetic suggestion? Or was it something far more profound?
Think about it.
What does it mean to fundamentally change the color of your hair? It's a declaration.
It's a way of telling the world that the person you were yesterday is not the person you are today.
For Norma Jean Dougherty, it was a baptism, a chemical rebirth.
She sat in that salon chair, and as the pungent bleach stripped the brown from her hair, it felt like it was stripping away everything else too.
The orphanage, the endless foster homes, the name, Norma Jean, which was now synonymous with abandonment and disappointment.
As she watched her hair turn from brown to a brassy red, and finally to a brilliant, almost white, honey blonde, she was watching the death of her old self. The girl who was passed around, the girl who was married off for convenience, the girl nobody wanted, was being erased.
And a new woman was walking out of that salon. This blonde woman wasn't a victim. She was a product, a commodity,
perfectly engineered for mass consumption.
She started getting work immediately. Magazine covers, advertisements for toothpaste and bathing suits.
She was a quick study, a director's dream.
She gave the camera what it wanted. She was becoming successful. And back on a ship in the Pacific, her husband, Jim Dougherty, was getting letters and seeing pinup photos of a blonde bombshell who was legally his wife, but who was becoming a complete stranger. When the war ended, and he returned home in 1946, he didn't come back to the quiet, compliant teenage housewife he had left behind. He came back to a woman with a career, a woman with ambition, a woman who had tasted a different kind of life and was not going to give it up. He gave her an ultimatum, the one that men who feel their control slipping away always give. It's me or your career. You have to choose. You can be Mrs. Dougherty, the housewife, or you can be whatever this new thing is. He thought it was a choice. He thought she would buckle. He thought the security he offered, the life he represented, would be enough to pull her back from the edge of her foolish dreams. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He thought he had married Norma Jean Baker, the orphan. He didn't realize that person no longer existed. He was talking to a ghost. The woman standing in front of him wasn't choosing between a husband and a career. She was choosing between a past that had almost destroyed her and a future she would control. Between the cage of his expectations and the terrifying freedom of her own ambition. Her decision was brutal and instantaneous. She filed for divorce in Las Vegas. She signed the papers, severing the last link to her old life. She walked away from the man who had saved her from the orphanage without a moment's hesitation. Why? Because he hadn't just saved her. He had become part of the system that contained her. He was another foster home, another set of walls, and she was done with walls. This act, this divorce, is often portrayed as the tragic end of her first love. But that's a fairy tale. This was not a heartbreak. It was a corporate restructuring. She was shedding a non-performing asset. She was clearing the way for a new venture. And the name of that venture was not yet known, but she could feel it taking shape. The shy, stuttering, unwanted Norma Jean was dead and buried. The blonde model was a stepping stone. Now she set her sights on the only place big enough for the scale of her ambition: Hollywood. But how does an unknown model with no connections, no training, and a past she needs to keep buried break into the most ruthless, protected industry on earth? She didn't have a plan. She had a strategy, the same one she had been perfecting since she was a child. Find out what people want, and then become it. She began to haunt the edges of the studio system, going to parties, meeting casting agents, producers, anyone who would talk to her. She quickly learned that in Hollywood, a pretty face was a dime a dozen. You needed more. You needed a story, an angle, and her real story, the one filled with madness, foster homes, and a munitions factory, was not the kind of story a studio wanted to sell. So she began to invent a new one. This is the moment where the lies began. Not small lies, but foundational, myth-making fabrications that would one day become so entangled with the truth that even she would have trouble telling them apart. She told them her mother was dead. It was cleaner that way. A dead mother is a tragic backstory. A mother in a mental institution is a liability. A genetic time bomb that scares superstitious studio heads. She told them she was a plucky orphan who had pulled herself up by her bootstraps, glossing over the endless, complicated shuffle of homes. She was curating her own history, creating a character for the producers before she even stepped in front of a camera. She was auditioning for the role of a lifetime, the role of a movie star. It was at a party, one of dozens she attended, that she caught the eye of Ben Lyon, a casting director at 20th Century Fox. He saw the same thing everyone else did. The impossible luminescence, the way the camera seemed to adore her. He offered her a screen test. The screen test was a success. The studio executives were impressed. They saw potential. They offered her a standard 6-month contract, $75 a week. It was her entry into the dream factory. But there was one final problem. Her name, Norma Jean Doherty. It was clunky. It was plain. It sounded like the housewife she had just paid a lawyer to stop being. Ben Lyon thought so too. He sat her down in his office. "We need something else," he said. He suggested Marilyn. It had a nice rhythm, a soft, all-American sound. Then, it was her turn. She suggested a name from her own fractured family tree. Her mother's maiden name. A name that connected her, perhaps for the last time, to the woman who gave her life and then vanished from it. The name was Monroe. Marilyn Monroe. It sounded perfect, like it was always meant to be. In that office, with a stroke of a pen, the transformation was complete. The legal and symbolic death of Norma Jean was finalized. A new entity was born. A corporate creation, designed for stardom. She had a new name, a new look, a new, carefully edited history. She was finally, officially, someone else. But here's the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. When you kill every version of yourself to become a dream, what happens when you wake up? Who is left? She had the contract. She had the name. She had the face. Now, all she had to do was become the biggest star in the world. And for a woman who had survived the system, how hard could that possibly be? She was about to find out. The Hollywood she had just entered was not a dream factory. It was a slaughterhouse. And it was hungry. The slaughterhouse didn't know what hit it. It expected a lamb and got a wolf in sheep's clothing. She played the game better than the men who invented it. Every whisper of scandal she spun into mystique. Every affair was a calculated move on a chessboard only she could see. She weaponized her vulnerability, turning the world's desire for her into a shield and a sword. The studio thought they were molding her, but she was molding them, forcing them to build a pedestal high enough for the goddess she was becoming. She reached the summit. She was no longer just a star. She was a constellation, the most famous woman on a planet that was suddenly shrinking, connected by newsreels and magazine covers that all bore her face. But the terrible irony was this. The cage she had escaped was replaced by a prison of her own design. A prison of fame, where every wall was a human eye, every bar a camera lens. The dream had been realized, and the dream was a nightmare. She was a product so perfect, so beloved, that she was no longer allowed to be a person. The entity known as Marilyn Monroe, the corporate creation, had achieved total market saturation. But the ghost of Norma Jean, the one who had signed the contract, began to rattle her chains. She wanted out. She wanted to breathe. The conflict that had simmered for years became a raging fire. It was the ultimate battle for creative control, fought not in a boardroom, but in the landscape of a single, tormented soul. Marilyn, the icon, needed the applause to survive. Norma Jean, the survivor, was being suffocated by it. In the end, a choice had to be made. A final corporate restructuring. The venture had become untenable. The CEO and the founder could no longer coexist. On August 4, 1962, the board meeting was called to a close. The company was dissolved. Marilyn Monroe, the greatest star in the world, was a liability that could no longer be carried. And Norma Jean, the girl who started it all, was finally, permanently, laid off. There was no one left to wake up. But her death was not an ending. It was a transfiguration. Freed from the mortal coil of Norma Jean, the corporate entity, Marilyn Monroe, achieved what she had always wanted: immortality. She became pure myth, a ghost in the machine of global culture. Her image sold, her story told, her essence endlessly debated. She didn't just conquer Hollywood. She haunted it. She haunted all of us. The girl who was told she was nothing became everything. An icon, a warning, a dream, a tragedy. She was the ultimate architect of her own identity, and in the end, the blueprint she created was both her masterpiece and her eulogy. Her story is the story of Hollywood itself, a boulevard of broken dreams and transcendent myths. To understand the blueprint, to walk the boulevards of the other legends who gambled with their souls, subscribe to Boulevard_of_Monroe.